So what we'll be covering is our methodology that we've developed at Adaptive Edge in terms of how we approach and start projects, the processes that we use to design and test, as well as deploy and support. Some of it will be specific to SharePoint Online, including a demo by Tom Gazinski from AvePoint, but some of it will be applicable to any project where the goal is to establish a new solution. So let's jump right in. Obviously, the first step is to gather requirements. While that has almost become cliche in a way, you know, and how it's mentioned at conferences and meetings, I've always found myself, you know, wanting more detailed information. What kind of requirements? Who do I talk to? And what do I ask? What I'm going to show you is our methodology and how we approach this topic. But I will say that I'm not a believer necessarily in best practices or a standardized approach, or rather a standardized way of you know, running through every project. Sometimes you have to adapt your approach and framework to suit the scenario. And while this is maybe where we start, it may look different in terms of where we end up. This is a list of requirements that I've come across, and I think is the best way to frame up the requirements in general. And again, this is subject to, you know, this is subject to every situation and every scenario is different. But in general, this seems to be you know, an approach that I prefer. So a business requirement. One example of a business requirement is, let's say, reduce the amount of time it takes for prospects to become opportunities. The functional requirement of that would be, you know, let's say centralizing prospects on a hub site, or giving the, you know, sales team forms. Non-functional requirements are requirements that don't necessarily add any value. So those are requirements like policies, stuff that you have to comply with. And then testing. Every requirement should be verified and tested. You should have a set of milestones for each potential solution, you know, that it needs to pass in order for it to be a viable option. And then technical. Our last step is technical. Now that we have the previous 4 requirements outlined, you know, the idea is that we can easily evaluate and swap out different technical options without having them dictate business requirements, which is what happens a lot of times. What I see frequently is I'll ask a you know, an end user or stakeholder for a business requirement, and they'll say, I want a drop-down box. A drop-down box isn't a business requirement. You know, that can fit into number 2, into a functional requirement. How do we accomplish something? But you know, our goal when we start gathering these requirements, when we start doing the interviews and asking the questions, is to understand what the overlying kind of strategy and goal is, what the solutions should look like at the end of the process. So who do we talk to? I find that it helps to divide our interviews into 3 separate audiences. The sponsors give, you know, kind of the commander's intent, the overall goal and strategy. The technical staff helps us understand what they're licensed for, who they already talked to, and what they would prefer we didn't tell the users. And end users ideally give us their pain points, day-to-day work patterns, stuff like that. At the end, we go back to the project team, review the feedback from each one of the different groups that we've interviewed, and put together a picture that is, you know, both high level where it needs to be, and then it gets down into specific items, you know, as we've gathered from the end users. I'm not a fan of long meetings, and I question, you know, their effectiveness, to be honest. By the time you get to the end of a 1 to 2 hour long meeting, you've forgotten what you started with, or you know, you feel like you want to. We schedule 30-minute meetings, or you know, our team generally approaches most situations by scheduling 30-minute meetings for our initial round of interviews. That way, the attendees, you know, are more likely to accept. It shows that we are cognizant of their schedules, not wanting to take up a huge amount of their time. And if we need to schedule a follow-up, you know, we will. But it helps us get right to the point and, you know, nothing more. And I prefer one-on-one meetings initially, because when you interview people in a group, you tend to get a bunch of nodding heads. And, you know, I need candid feedback. Candid feedback is one of the most important things, you know, when you're trying to discover what it is that they really want to accomplish. So we ask a set of standardized questions. These are designed to be general enough, so that we're not leading them into an answer necessarily, but we do want specific feedback on certain topics. One area that I want to highlight is the third bullet point, bright spots. It's easy to come up with pain points, but we also want to understand if there are any areas or processes that we can emulate, use as a guide for our design, so that we're not dismissing any initiatives when they reorganized a folder structure or something like that. You'd be surprised at how hard it is for some people to find something positive to say about a system. It's easy to list out the pain points. But when they can list out the positives that we can emulate, it's incredibly useful. One thing that I've learned is that while I know a fair amount about information architecture or SharePoint relative to entry level, the people that I'm talking to likely don't. And the more I use jargon, the quicker I will lose the audience. So I think it's important that we understand and that we as a team consider the term curse of knowledge. What makes sense to you may not make sense to the person you're talking to. In the same way that I'm unfamiliar with tax law, if somebody were to ask me, give me a use case for your taxes, I wouldn't have the slightest clue where to start. So when you ask someone, give me a use case for your documents and records management, strategy for your taxonomy, they're going to be confused. They're going to, more than likely, they will look at you with kind of a blank stare. So just be aware that they don't know as much about SharePoint as you might, or whatever the platform is that you're going to. Also, it's important that we go into these interviews with an open mind. There's a Buddhist term called beginner's mind. And the way that I think it applies here is that we have to assume we don't know in order to be able to learn from the user and discover a new angle, discover things in general. There will be times when you can fill in the blanks. And I would say that don't assume that just because you've worked with a solution for another department or another company in the past, that it will necessarily be the same. A company maintains a competitive edge for a reason. They have a proprietary way of doing things. They will inherently do things differently than a different company. So again, there are things that you've learned that you can apply, but we try to go into every situation with a very open mind. Particularly when we're learning from the user, we want to make sure that they understand that we are, we're deferring to them, to their judgment. So once we've gone through the interviews, we summarize our findings in a recommendation report, which is essentially structured like a problem statement. Describing the ideal state of affairs gives you a target to aim for. That will help you predict and decide and eliminate scope creep as you head into the next phase, which is start designing. So our initial approach is to establish a preliminary design. We do that by inventorying the content, determining what's in scope, that term rot, redundant, out of date, or trivial, mapping where the content exists currently to where it will exist in the new platform. Also, mapping whether or not there's a system that's dependent on, let's say, an on-premises SharePoint environment or a file share, whatever it might be. When we assess the risk, an example is, do we have enough people to take part in the solution? When we start engaging on it, is there going to be, some end of year, billing cycle that all of a sudden everybody's going to be unavailable for? Are we licensed for certain things? The question often comes up, as far as how much content we should gather, how comprehensive we should be. And I tend to get pretty detailed as far as the inventory and, immerse myself in the content, learn as much as I can about it. You don't necessarily have to go that deep. I would say just inventorying the content to the extent that you can include or exclude it from your scope, and then get more detailed with the in-scope content as appropriate. Sometimes I run PowerShell reports that go recursively through the folder structures. If we're going from a shared drive into SharePoint, I'll run a recursive PowerShell script that exports, a CSV that has a list of every file, every folder within a network drive. That can be pretty overwhelming, but that way I'm asking questions from a point of I have some context as to what the questions that I'm asking. I'm not coming in completely blind. I understand that they're structuring folders, by status or by year or by client or however it might be. So I have some visibility into the network drive that they may not even have, the end users, that is. AvePoint has some amazing reports that that you can run and that you can get even more visibility into the content that you're dealing with. And Tom will talk a little bit about that as we get towards the end, but that's essentially how we start the preliminary design. So there are essentially three migration methods that I've had experience with and that have become somewhat standard. The first is a fresh start. That is, don't migrate anything, just start using the SharePoint Online site for new projects. I know this is really more about migrating processes than actual content, and the actual content is then migrated as part of the normal day-to-day. The second is lift and shift. This is essentially pending content that you can't migrate because of size. You move everything over in its current state. This is not the approach that I favor initially in most cases, because while you may be able to check a box and say that you've migrated everything, I think the question remains, what have you done to make the users' work lives better? You're going to have to reorganize at some point, and chances are that you've taken whatever has grown organically over the course of multiple years and put it behind a new URL. That is not always the case, but those lift and shift projects that I've been a part of or that our team has assisted with, that's been our experience. So every situation is different. And again, using a tool like AvePoint, it allows you to be more deliberate and coordinated with those lift and shift type of approaches. But the third option is optimized. This is where you analyze the way that the content is structured prior to the migration, determine if it's in an organized structure that you can leverage, and if not, reorganize it, test it with the users, create a new structure, and then map the content over before you migrate. This introduces a change in the way the content is structured, but you're more likely to end up with, I believe that you're more likely to end up with an information architecture that is improved and provides a more efficient work process for the users. When it comes to the term information architecture, we're essentially referring to the way that you organize content so that you can find what you're looking for. Your current folder structure in the network drive is a good example of an information architecture. Peter Morville, one of the authors of the information architecture book, is actually where this is taken from. If you want to learn more about it, it's a very subjective kind of, I don't even know how to describe it, wonky type of topic. So definitely check out Peter Morville, Rosenfield, I don't remember what his first name is, but information architecture, findability, some of those newer terms that have come about, they pertain to internet design a lot of the times, website design, et cetera. But what we're doing now is essentially moving the documents and records that we have into a website. So all of it is kind of relative, and it all comes back to how easy is it for me to find what I'm looking for. A couple of key considerations from designing an information architecture. It should be complete enough for you to find what you're looking for. The user should be able to look at it and recognize the pattern so that they can build on it later. A good example is the way that milk is listed on two different sites, Walmart and Whole Foods. You can see that Walmart is structuring milk under beverages, while Whole Foods has it in a different category. Even though they're different in how they're structured, the user can look at this and understand where to put a new type of product, let's say coffee creamer or milk-related product. So it's a very oversimplified example, but that's the idea, is that they can look at it, and they can say, oh, okay, I get where this fits. Now, achieving that, design is not as easy as just, all the IT guys gathering in a room and saying, hey, this is how I think the users are gonna look for content. While that might be a good initial attempt, that's one of the biggest mistakes that I see, is that people do that, IT staff do that, and they go to the users and say, hey, we've got this new way of doing things, good luck, and expect that the benefits will be self-evident, that just because they've reorganized it and they've used some method in the past that it works for the users. It's not necessarily true. So what you want to do is list everything out. You go back to the content inventory and you look at what's in scope, what are the categories of the content that we want to restructure, and figure out how it is that it makes sense to the users. It's a lot less work for you as the designer, and it's more of just taking the answers that the users give you and optimizing that and kind of redesigning it. So how do you do that? The term card sorting is one that you may or may not have heard of, but it's something that I rely on quite a bit, and I've definitely tried to bring my skills up to where they need to be, in terms of understanding the way that you approach card sorts and what the point of the card sort is. So the first step is to list the elements we want to have in our solution on a separate card. One thing to note, these aren't departments. We know how people are going to sort departments. We don't want to have them sort things that are obvious. We want to understand how users group and label things that are unstructured or subjective. So you list things on different cards. You have the users sort them into groups, and then they label them according to why they have grouped them together. And that could be, the label on these could be index cards or post-it notes. The label could be, I label these together because I don't know what they are. And that's fine. I want to learn why it is that they did that. And I want to understand that, because while I might group something a certain way, they might look at it completely different. Again, kind of going back to the curse of knowledge in the beginner's mind. So you want to understand how they are looking at things, because it's very different from how you're looking at it. A closed card sort is similar in that we have a set of terms that we need to sort, but we're using predetermined categories. Keep in mind that the groups that we have listed in the categories may not necessarily reflect our navigation structure or our information architecture. But rather, we want to learn the tendencies and associations that users make when grouping content, so that our proposed navigation structure fits. So let's assume that we create our ideal navigation structure. How do we know if it's right? We use something called tree testing. In tree testing, we list our proposed top-level categories on the first index card, 1 through 5 or whatever. And then we list out the second level on the next index card, and so on and so on. Then we give the user a scenario. If we were testing their ability to find an expense report template, and that template was in option 2.4.4, we wouldn't ask them, go find the expense report document. More than likely, we would try to ask, or we would say, you've just returned from a trip, you need to get reimbursed. Which option do you choose? So let's say they pick option 2 on the card. We give them the card for option 2, which has 2.1, 2.2, 2.3. When they make the selection on option 2, we give them the card for option 2.4, let's say. What we're simulating here is them clicking through a proposed folder structure or site topology. But when they do it on a screen, they endlessly click through the folders until they find what they're looking for. And that's not what we're going for. What we want to find out, or what we want to achieve, is providing a structure where they can find something the first time. So in the case of a tree test, they get 2 tries. If they can't find it by the second try, we go back to the drawing board. Like I said, we want to make things findable, not findable by stumble clicks. So hopefully after the round of card sorts and testing, we can put together a structure that we feel is competent and usable, that we feel competent and is usable, and makes sense to the user because we've tested it. I use a mind mapping program to put together topologies like this. It's a lot easier than Visio, allows you to visualize the structure away from the site. So why is it final-ish? Things change. You learn as you go along. Requirements change, companies change, everything changes. That's really the only thing that is guaranteed in any business is that things will rest of the department. So while this may be a tested structure that you're set on, the ability to adapt to new elements and considerations along the way is invaluable. It's an important quality that will show the businesses that it's about making sure that they're taken care of first and foremost. Step 3, test and pilot. We start with test migrations to help us discover issues that we may not have been aware of during planning. It also helps us understand how long a migration may take, which can help with scheduling. We also want to make sure that we put it into the hands of select users as soon as possible to understand how they will react to the new site. No surprises. And that's not to say that we give it to all users and we say, hey, look, here it is, go collaborate. We have a group of users that we've hopefully defined beforehand and that are willing to participate in it. We want to see what their reactions are to the new site. Again, we don't know what they don't know, and we want to learn that. So as often as you can, every chance that you get, interacting and reaching back and creating a touch point with the users and saying, hey, here's this, here's the card sort, here's the tree test, here's the site, what do you think about this? And always getting that feedback means that it's not developed in a vacuum. It means that it's, there's no surprises at the end. We don't get to the end of it and say, well, you guys never told us. We've had the opportunity and we've opened that line of communication throughout the project. And I think that's important. And that among everything is most important, is that it's the constant, feedback. We use Agile a lot, which I'll get into in a second, but that's a huge, principle of Agile. Okay, so once we've tested and accounted for any issues that we might encounter, along with the duration and user experience, we move into piloting the solution. This is the next step in having a select group of users actually using the solution, making sure that it works for their needs and that our assumptions are correct. If there are any issues, we review them immediately, improve, and then move forward. The goal of this stage is acknowledging that we don't know what we don't know. Until you actually start using the solution with production content in your day-to-day, you may not be aware of an incorrect assumption or any other potential issue. If there aren't any, great, then you move on. But it's important that you don't skip this step. So one thing you'll notice is that we're, I mentioned before, we're big advocates for putting the solution in the hands of the users as soon as possible. Test our assumptions, design, get their feedback. That's based on our adoption of the Scrum framework and how we approach projects. The key concept being, don't develop the solution in a vacuum. Again, don't pop out of a cake at the end of a 3-month process with something that no one has seen or tested that could likely be the wrong thing. We're not, at Adaptive Edge, we're not necessarily Scrum purists. We've adopted kind of several key tenets of Scrum, but the first, but it's definitely a, kind of a hacked version of Scrum. It works for us. There's no burn down charts. We don't get crazy with it. But the first is to make, the first key consideration is to make the work public. We use an Excel document as a product backlog or a list of everything that needs to be completed in the project. This list grows and it is constantly added to throughout the project. So when somebody comes to me and they say, hey, we have this new, this new thing, we want it alphabetized, we want it reverse alphabetized, we want, we want to introduce this element that we haven't talked about at all. It's not an issue, and a lot of times people throw their hands up in the air, and at least I did, when I first started, be like, oh, that's out of scope, or that's, can't do that. We already planned. We're already in the deployment phase. Can't go back. Again, being able to adapt to that change, you're going to learn things along the way. So it's not like they're going to, your assumptions that you started with, particularly if it's a larger project, even the smaller projects take, it can take months. So it's not like nothing's going to change in between now and then. Everything just doesn't stop because you're migrating to SharePoint Online. So, that product backlog is really helpful. It's really simple too. It's a list of things that we have to do. But we maintain a heartbeat by planning what we're going to do, doing it, and then reviewing it at the end of the week. We have a daily stand-up meeting or email, depending on what the customer prefers. The key with those daily stand-ups is to identify any impediments that might be holding us back from completing our goals that week. Again, this allows us to easily adapt and change with issues and new requirements that come up. there's a rule, I'm not sure where it is, but probably read it in some book or saw it on a webinar. It's called the 5% rule. If you address an issue within the 5% of the time of it coming up, it's much easier to address it than when it's grown for weeks and weeks and it's now a 30, 40% issue. So we've designed, we've tested, we've piloted. Now we're ready to migrate and cut over. Communication leading up to and during the migration is obviously incredibly important. Again, don't develop in a vacuum, don't do anything in a vacuum. No surprises. The first key, communication piece is awareness. The user needs to be aware of the need for change. They need to know what to expect so they can prepare, and when to expect it. Knowledge. They need knowledge of how the migration will be done. It increases their willingness to help. And ability. They need to be trained on how the new solution works and how to use it. One idea that might be useful to consider is using a migration site to centralize schedules and training material for the users. So if they have any questions, they can go to the site and see exactly what's happening so they won't feel out of the loop. And all that you have to do in order to, assuming of course, to go in and access the site, all you have to do as the designer or the team lead is to go in and make sure the site's updated. So you can get people to use that as a kind of that single source of truth, that checkpoint for the migration. Then this might be a good option for you to use. Along the same lines, along those same lines is the issue of change management. If we are introducing a new process, we need to be able to shepherd the users through that change and not just assume that they'll get it because, again, it's obvious, self-evident. I've been studying change management more recently and come across the concept of 3 R's, which I think is particularly valuable. It's really easy. Change management is a complex topic, and this really helped me understand what I need to consider as we're going into that phase. So 3 R's: relate. You relate to the users, that you've been in their shoes, you get what they're going through. You establish a relationship so that you're seen as an advocate. You reframe. You help them understand why it is that we need to change. Paint the picture of what the future state looks like and what it'll take to get there. And then repeat. Practice it in action over and over. Make it part of their day-to-day. Make it part of it's their go-to. It's changing their association. When you go to create a folder, instead of doing that, create this metadata tag or whatever it is that you're trying to ingrain and try to make part of their daily work habits. It's got to be repeated. You've got to go back and constantly reinforce that. You're likely introducing a new process where they have a process that they've been doing for 10 years. So there's a quote by Machiavelli, which I was going to put in here, but it was too kind of dystopian and whatever. But the idea is, behind the quote is that people are, late adopters and will only kind of adopt a solution after everybody else has. So, getting it to be part of their day-to-day and part of their regular work pattern is important. So step 5 is providing support. Thing that I like to use that I stole from someone or that I don't know, mutated from someone. I think I stole it from Bill Gates. The first day shouldn't be the best day. It's important that you don't stop at the end of a project. You need to evolve with the users. Just like any other, any other element that there's a critical business process in the organization. It needs to grow as the business processes grow, grow with it. So it's not just because you've migrated doesn't mean that it stops there. We need to help them retain the information they've learned. Regular lunch and learn sessions, short, just-in-time training that is immediately applicable to their day-to-day. Maybe in those lunch and learn sessions, you can showcase and highlight different groups and how they are currently using the solution or the sites or the OneDrive or whatever it might be to manage their work and their project successfully. I used to do a lot of training for Department of Energy, Department of Interior, New Horizons, et cetera, et cetera. And I would do these huge long training sessions. And while those might be useful for IT guys, I question their effectiveness with just kind of the average user, because when they leave a 40-hour training class, it's so much information. So I wouldn't say that it's not the right approach. I think that in some cases you do have to do that, all in one, you learn everything about everything approach. But in general, when it comes to having them adopt a particular new solution that you're developing, it's much easier to do just-in-time lunch and learn short trainings. All we're doing this day is just learning how to upload files and check in, check out, and open them from Office. Or we're going to review the OneDrive for Business sync client for half an hour during lunch one day. And then, you get people to understand that it's a regular thing, just like these webinars. It's a regular thing that they're going to come, that we're going to be reviewing kind of key aspects of things as we go along. All right. So let's talk about what won't migrate, our favorite topic. Assuming that you are migrating from an on-premises version of SharePoint, there's a list of things that you'll have to consider, either remapping or circumventing, assuming that you're migrating using the out-of-the-box method that Microsoft has outlined. Out-of-the-box migration process is essentially connect to SharePoint Online using PowerShell, define your source and target content, and then push go. There are some key limitations that I'd like to call out here that we run into during our own migrations, and the first is the web application level settings. I'll get to it more on the next slide, but the one thing that we can't do anymore is increase the list item view throttling, which you'll remember is set to 5,000 items by default. Managed paths is a big one. If you have leveraged any custom managed paths like departments as an example, or projects, or whatever it is. And then we have permissions. There's a star there because this is more of a gotcha than a limitation necessarily. Permissions are a complex topic, obviously, and one bullet point won't cover it. And while there are some parameters that you can flag in the out-of-the-box upload process to maintain permissions, chances are if you're doing any kind of reorganizing, you're going to want to shift around the permissions as well. While this applies to the out-of-the-box migrations, when you're using a tool like DocApp from AvePoint, you have a number of options to help you with those challenges, which Tom will be showing you. Some key considerations that we've run into in our own migrations, some things that have come up regularly. So migrating my sites to OneDrive. OneDrive is, in its current state has its roots in My Sites. My Sites were SkyDrive sites, and then they were OneDrive for Business, and et cetera, et cetera. There's some, limitations to what you can do. Essentially, what you need to do if you are doing an out-of-the-box migration is you pre-create all the My Sites using PowerShell if you want to migrate them over. And then you can either do it one by one, using the out-of-the-box migration tool, which is potentially excruciating. I'm sure there's a way that you can PowerShell it. Or you consider a manual migration. Let the users migrate it. Leave the clutter behind. Maybe don't migrate everything. Let them know, hey, this is what it is. Just like when you're using any kind of online, tool set outside of OneDrive. It's the same concept. You don't migrate everything over. It's just the stuff that's immediately relevant to you. And while that might be a lot, it's not, everything in the kitchen sink. There is, as far as I'm aware, a 20,000 item sync limit in a library. So if you have 20,000 items in a My Site, or will end up in a OneDrive for Business library, it won't sync. This may change. Office 365 is constantly changing, but as far as I'm aware, and you can pipe up if you think that different in the chat, but that's the limitation. One other strategy that you can use is migrating content via the sync client. Is having the sync client set up and then show them where that folder exists on their desktop, and saying just drag things into this folder and it syncs to your OneDrive. Large lists, if we frequently run into on-prem deployments where the lists have grown larger than 5,000 items. The option is to either break them up into separate lists or make sure that you have one of the columns indexed prior to migrating it over. You also have to make sure that there aren't any views on that list that are over 5,000 items. Because if there are any views, whether it's the default view or not, our experience is that you will encounter issues. Migration account, whatever account you're using for the migration, we use the AvePoint tool quite a bit. And while this might be a unique situation, we had a customer that I don't think they changed the password. The password changed, and it wasn't fun. Don't change the migration account password. It's going to result in a bunch of random issues. You don't want to do that. It's not fun at all. And then I, hesitated to even bring this up, but Fab 40 templates, of course. We were all such fans of it in 2010, and I guess it existed in 2007. I don't remember, but all of those Fab 40 templates, learning site and community site, and I don't even remember some of them. They're not going to migrate over. So we only encountered it when we're using the AvePoint tool. So I don't even know what the impact will be if you're trying to go out of the box with Fab 40. Imagine you'll run into some issue and you've got to, actually, no, I do. You'd have to have the structure in place beforehand. So you'd have to create the site and then migrate everything over into the site. So with the AvePoint tool, it'll just go to a default site definition, like a team site or what have you. Okay, some final notes as far as this process is to just keep plugging along. I don't want to scare anyone with this slide and think that it's going to be some giant initiative that's going to consume your entire life, but it's not nothing. If you're introducing any kind of change in your organization, it's going to require a little bit of stamina on your part. It's going to require caffeine, or almonds or whatever. However you get your energy, make sure you have it. Yeah, just keep plugging away, because we have completed these projects. I know this is how to start, and I think that how to complete will probably be a longer webinar, much further in the future. When we look back on it, and we have completed these migrations, it's definitely, it's a sense of accomplishment, obviously, but it was no small task getting there. So one thing I didn't mention at the beginning is, if you do have any questions, we should have time at the end to go through them, so you can raise your hand or type the question in the chat window at the end. But I just want to make sure I note that. So I just want to introduce you to AvePoint. AvePoint is one of our go-to partners, or our go-to partner for any migration governance, any utility that we need for either SharePoint Online or on-premises, particularly when it comes to migration, but especially when it comes to governance, compliance, anything where we need the solution to grow with the company. Having a product, having the products that AvePoint offers allows you to grow with the solution. So again, the first day isn't the best day. So you can continue to add to it, and the admin side is much less. So with that, I want to introduce and hand it over to Tom Gazinski with AvePoint, and he will walk you through their migration tool. Tom, I'm going to switch it to you, and the floor is yours.
Great. Thanks, Troy. I appreciate that. Yeah, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to share my screen out with everybody, just so that you guys can see what it may take to actually, complete that migration process. Let me go ahead and get that there. All right. So I should have that shared out. My name is Tom Gazinski. I work with AvePoint. A little bit of background on us and the different things that we offer. All of our software is built in-house. We don't purchase any of it. We don't buy anyone out for it. We build and develop all of this in-house. things from migration to governance to compliance. Those are all different options that we offer. Okay. Obviously today we're focusing primarily on the migration part of this, getting customers of ours and Adaptive Edge into Office 365 or SharePoint 2013, 2016. Those are, that's a very familiar topic, something that is seen quite a bit here. From a migration standpoint, there are a couple of different sources that we can migrate you from. All right. Obviously, SharePoint being one of them. The second most common is probably right around file system migration, right? Moving file shares into SharePoint, moving file shares into OneDrive for Business. Those types of things are something that we see all the time. If we're removing our SharePoint on-premise infrastructure and moving into Office 365, usually the file shares follow, right? Let's eliminate all these servers. Now, once you start to get rid of a few of them, it's time to get rid of all of them if you can. So we do offer that. The other options too, I mean, if you're using Lotus Notes, if you want to migrate Exchange public folders into SharePoint, quicker eRoom, all of those things, we can handle from a migration standpoint. A couple of things that Troy did touch on, the discovery phase of all of this. Obviously, migration is, it's what you make out of it. If we're going to be taking everything and just moving it over, so be it. However, this is your opportunity to do a great deal of cleanup as well. Okay, so from a discovery standpoint, there are some things that we can help with from that even. Creating reports. This is obviously a Power BI report, but having a report around how much data is sitting out there in these sites, right? How many sites do we have within all of these site collections? Those are all things that can actually play into effect of how long your migration might take, right? When you bring this project to the table or you're tasked with completing a project like this, it's often important to know how long will this actually take you. So being able to see not only how many items are out there, but sorting through at what year were these things last modified. Okay, that is important information to have. Also, how many site collections do we have hanging around out there? Right? If I look in my SharePoint, my internal intranet here, I can see that I actually have 243 subsites beneath this one site collection. All right. I can also see then the size within the content databases as well. All right. From a migration, if I go into the SharePoint migration part of this, there are some things to be aware of. From a speed standpoint, there are pieces, around using CSOM or using high-speed migration APIs. Obviously, that all stands from how much data do we have to move and how quickly do we have to get it there, right? If it's a project that's kind of going to take us a year and we're aware of it and we're moving little by little, we're tipping our toes into the water, and then, we're going to jump right in. But if it's one of those things that we need to get this done in a hurry, we might want to look at using some high-speed migration options. Okay, the differences in speed are quite significant, at least from moving from content into Office 365. Okay, when we start that migration, a couple of things to note here is migrating anything from 2007, 10, and 13 all the way into your Office 365 tenant or your SharePoint 2016 environment, we can handle that. There's no need to take almost like a jump from 2007 into 10 into 13 and so on and so forth. Okay, we've eliminated that using DocAv for that. You can see as I expand out my farm here on the left, I can see my different web applications. I can expand those out, see my site collections. I can expand those and I can see my lists, my libraries, and even my subsites. The reason for that is you can get very specific and granular in a sense of what do you want to move around, right? What do I need to migrate today? In this case, I have an accounting site selected here, right? So if I'm going to go ahead and say that I want to actually move this into, a new site collection in Office 365, I can. I can go ahead and expand out this site collection that I have. I can also take the site itself, right? So I'm selecting the site here. And then I can go ahead and select the top level site within this site collection. You can see I have two options in this area, right? Step one is what do I want to move? Step two is where do I want it to go? And step three is what do I want it to look like, right? How do I want to move it there? If I merge it, I'm going to actually merge that content and that site into the top level site. However, if I go to attach it, I'm actually going to create a sub-site beneath there. So again, that reorganization part comes into play here. Okay, if I need to move things around and change the way that things are laid out, I can do that. Now is a great time. It's a great opportunity to make use of something like that. All right. The next step is one of the most important parts. I'm going to save this as a plan. The reason why we save this as a plan is that way we can schedule this to run accordingly. If we're going to go ahead and say that I want this to run just one time, so be it. I can just do a full migration on a Sunday. Everyone comes in Monday morning. There we go. Like Troy pointed out earlier, though, that's not usually the best option, right? We're going to want to go through a planning phase, really an incremental approach to get our end users there, because although it's a big task for us in IT, it's a huge, daunting task for any of our end users, right? What is this going to look like? Is all of my data there? Are things going to be where I expect them to be? That's where the incremental approach comes into play. Okay, I can come in here and I can start this project and maybe say that I'm going to migrate my data over every couple of days, right? Maybe I'm going to migrate data over every single day, all right? At the same time while I'm doing this, though, I might go ahead and actually send out email notifications to any of the business groups that need to be aware of what's going on, right? From a migration standpoint, I actually want to let them know. So that way I'm very transparent with my end users as well. Yes, we're moving your data, but here, this is everything that's being moved. Okay, so a great way to look at that. If there's any kind of project planning committee for something like this in your organization, this can be very helpful. Okay, the profile within the migration plan, this is all about what do we want to bring with. You know, we originally selected that accounting site. We looked at that Power BI report, and we saw that there was some data that was created a couple of years ago, right? If I want to exclude any of that content from the migration, maybe somebody is saying that, hey, you know what, any of those documents that were created, you know, let's say last access time here, right? So anything that was created older than, say, 3 years ago, I'm not interested in bringing that over. Again, when you move to Office 365, it's more than just SharePoint. It's more than just OneDrive. Once you start making use of things like Delve and other content, you know, that's being, you know, collaborated on and making use of, we're going to want to make sure that the data that is out there is relevant to your end users. Okay, this is your time to clean up the environment. That never happens in IT, right? Once we give something out, it's very hard to take it back. So this is your opportunity to make something like that happen. All right, so we can start to trim these things out. What do we want to exclude? Again, the more we remove, the faster our migration gets done. Okay, obviously there may be things around an end user coming back and saying, hey, you know what, I really needed that data. You can always come back into your migration plan and change this. So instead of saying, all right, I'm not going to bother anything that was accessed, you know, 3 years ago, I'm going to go ahead and change this to 1. Right, or anything that maybe even a longer period of time. So now it's anything that hasn't been accessed in 6 years, I'm not going to bother with. Okay. The other options that we have, obviously, if you're using any managed metadata, we can bring some of that over as well. Workflow definitions, let's bring that with us also. You've probably spent quite a bit of time developing some of those workflows. If it's anything along the lines of like a SharePoint designer or out-of-the-box workflow, those usually move across pretty well. Okay. The one thing Troy did touch on as well is actually any mapping options. So if you think of like permissions or even bigger than that, right? Let's think of users that, if we're using SharePoint 2010, obviously our organization has changed in that span of time, right? Not all of those users are still here today. So what happens with their data, right? With the users that are disabled or deleted from Active Directory and those user profiles that have been removed, let's map them. Okay, so we can create a user mapping here to actually say that, you know, anything that was created by Veronica, I'm going to map over to Kevin. Okay, Kevin works in that department. Veronica's no longer there. I'm going to have Kevin take ownership of this. At the same time, if I don't want to create a user mapping for every user that may have left the organization, I can also use a default target user. This is just to replace the metadata on those files, make sure that it's moved across. It doesn't come across as Troy moved all of your content, right? So it might be a user account labeled, you know, migrated user data. All right. That way, all of that content has a relevant name attached to it, right? We know why it's there and why it looks that way. Okay. Advanced options within this. Really, when you move into Office 365, some of the big things that people make use out of is actually collapsing folder structure within document libraries. That may sound very scary to you if you have a lot of folders within your libraries. The nice thing about this, though, is instead of just collapsing it all down into the root, we can add a column and keep the source path. All right, it's going to add a column with a single line of text that actually displays out where did that file come from before, right? Where did it originate from? What folder was it a part of? Then your end users can sort through it. You can create custom views for it. Okay, make use of some of those, those big Office 365 changes that you're going to be experiencing. Obviously, that takes some training for your end users. We understand that. That's definitely where that incremental approach comes into play, right? And that way you can have training and those lunch and learns and kind of make use of some of those things as well. Okay, this profile that we're looking at, I know it may look daunting to some extent, but really all it boils down to is what do we want to bring with? What do we need to map, right? What do we need to change or modify? And then what do we want it to look like? Okay, once I save this, I can go ahead and reuse this for any of my future migrations as well. I don't have to reinvent the wheel every single time I run a migration job. All I'm going to be doing, selecting that profile, coming down here, and then going ahead and hit save. It'll run when I scheduled it, or save and run now and just let it take place. Okay. One thing to note about a migration, at least using DocAv here, is we're not going to be modifying your source. Okay, so we're not going to be touching anything in that your original SharePoint farm. Your end users can continue to go about their normal day-to-day process until you're ready to actually make that switch into, SharePoint 2013, 2016, or Office 365. All right. Again, what do we want to bring over? Where do we want it to go? What do we want it to look like? Okay. Once you get into something like Office 365 or any of those different places, obviously there are other concerns. How do I protect my data? How do I back it up? What do Microsoft's SLAs cover? AvePoint, here at AvePoint, we can handle all of those things as well. Obviously, Troy and Adaptive Edge are well aware of those different issues that you may face after the fact, right? That's a totally different conversation. But to get you into the cloud, to get you into SharePoint 2016, DocAv is definitely there to assist you with that and handle that process for you. All right, Troy, I'm going to turn it back over to you. I appreciate your time today. Let me show what this may look like.
Absolutely, I appreciate your time as well. That was awesome. I am going to share out my screen again, and we actually, while Tom was doing that, I figured out how to do the questions in the chat. I'm not sure about the hand raising, but we'll try that too. So if anyone has any questions, please feel free to ask them. We've got about 5 minutes left, 4 minutes. Anything relating to either the Adaptive Edge approach, methodology, or the AvePoint tool set. We have a hand raised. I think. Here, I'm just going to. Here we go. What are the cases for hybrid? This is a question from Steve. Okay, that's a good question. So a hybrid topology is you have some sites in the cloud, you have in SharePoint Online, and you have some sites that reside on premises. One that I prefer, and one that when it comes to the optimized approach, that I think is valuable, is having maybe a smaller SharePoint 2016 farm on premises, and then using that to index file shares or index other other line of business systems. So it's called hybrid search, and you can either have that once you do that, once you have the on-premises indexing the on-premises content, and you have your online content as well, you can either have your online content provide results from both online and on-prem, or you can have the on-prem provide on-prem and online. So I think that hybrid search is a great use case for it. Certainly when it comes to extranet sites, if you have an on-prem environment and you want to make the jump to extranet sites, a great use of SharePoint Online is for extranet sites. And you can have it set up so only certain audiences, only certain individuals have that capability, where they have sites where they can collaborate with law firms or external parties, whoever it might be, and you don't have to surface your deal with the reverse proxy and everything involved with having your internal on-premises SharePoint exposed to the internet. You can just let the SharePoint Online sites take care of that. And then you have the, we didn't really get into the sharing options when it comes to like OneDrive for Business or SharePoint Online, but you can share with anybody that has an email address. So, so I would say hybrid search is the case, or the hybrid use cases, hybrid search and hybrid extranet sites is what I would do. We've got about 1 to 2 minutes left. Oh, thank you, Steve. Anyone else have any questions? Just go ahead and ask them in the questions, because I don't know how to do the hand raising thing. Sorry. Pardon our dust. Okay. I do want to thank you. Thank everyone for coming. Tom, thank you. That was great. Really appreciate your time. Appreciate everything that AvePoint does, and I look forward to working with you guys on future projects. I hope that helped everyone. Please reach out, connect with us on LinkedIn. I don't have our email addresses up here, but just type in my name or type in Tom's name clearly. You'll be able to find us. We have pretty unique lessons. So connect with us on LinkedIn, ask any questions that come up. This is not going to be the last webinar. We're going to continue this going forward. So next month, we may have a different topic. We're still in the planning stages with that, but stay tuned. Follow us on LinkedIn and follow AvePoint on LinkedIn, Twitter, all of the above, and we'll be sure to provide updates and provide more content as we go forward. So really appreciate it, everyone. Have a great day.